time you do that, the value of the dollar goes down. This is a huge bubble that has to collapse. It has to. It's already collapsing around the world. And I'm going to give you some stats that have been compiled about what's going on right now all across the world. And don't think it's not coming to us. The unemployment rate in France has surged to 10.6%. The number of jobless claims in that country recently set an all-time high record. Unemployment in the Eurozone as a whole is sitting at an all-time record 12%. 2 years ago, Portugal's unemployment rate was at 12%. Today, Portugal's unemployment rate is 17%. The unemployment rate in Spain has set an all-time record of 27%. Even during the Great Depression of the 30s, the United States never had unemployment that high, 27%. Listen to this. The unemployment rate among those under the age of 25 in Spain is an astounding 57.2%. 57.2%. The unemployment rate in Greece has set an all-time record, 27.2%. The unemployment rate across the Eurozone goes up every single month. French car sales in March were 16% lower than they were the year earlier. Now you say 16% is not much. Well, when you talk about the car sales, the automobile sales for the entire country are down 16%. German car sales in March are down 17% over last year. In the Netherlands, consumer debt is up by 250% of available income. 250%. The number of Spanish firms filing for bankruptcy is 45% higher than it was a year ago. These are businesses going out of business, filing for bankruptcy, increased in 1 year 45%. Since 2007, the value of non-performing loans in Europe has increased by 150%. Bank withdrawals in Cyprus doubled, tripled. And I understand why. Remember in our last conversation, I was telling Bob when we were talking about that guy in Cyprus, he was so ticked off about them holding his money and not giving it to him. He pulled his bulldozer up to the bank, told him, you either give me my money or I'm going to bulldoze your bank. That's how bad it is. Spain, due to a crippling housing crash, there's approximately 3 million vacant homes in Spain today. So if you wanted to move to Spain, then there's 3 million homes on the market in Spain. Hey, maybe we can talk Democrats and the progressives into moving to Spain. Things have gotten so bad in Spain, the entire apartment buildings are being overwhelmed by squatters. Let me give you a story about that. Squatters, a 285-unit apartment complex in Parla, less than a half hour's drive from Madrid, should be an ideal target for investors seeking cheap property in Spain. Unfortunately, 2/3 of the building generates zero revenue because it's overrun by squatters. And this is happening all over their country, said Maria Farrell, the town's mayor, who estimates only 100 apartments in the block unit for the council have mid contracts. Not all tenants are paying either. Most lost their jobs. They can't pay mortgages or rent, so they lost their homes. And this has produced a tide of squatters. And they're letting them get away with it. The debt to GDP ratio in Italy is now up to 136%. Now, do you remember when we talked about this before? When the debt to GDP reaches 70-75%, you know the country is in trouble. If it reaches 100%, then you know you're on the verge of a collapse. If it goes over 100%, you're doomed. You can't pull out of that. And Italy is now up to 136%. So let's ask a common sense question here. How can you consume 4 apples when you only have 3? Do you see what I'm saying here? When your debt to GDP ratio is 136%, you're trying to eat 4 apples when you only have 3. 25% of all banking assets in the UK are in banks that are leveraged at least 4 to 1. 20% of all bank assets in the US are in the banks that are leveraged 40 to 1. German banking, Deutsche Bank has more than 55 trillion euros, which is more than $72 trillion of exposure to derivatives. The GDP of Germany for an entire year is only 2.7 trillion. You know, come on, man, that's elementary math to see how much trouble that is. Peter Schiff, this crisis is imminent. It's imminent. He said, I don't think Obama's going to finish his second term without the bottom dropping out. Stock market investors are oblivious to the problem, just like they were oblivious to the first one. Remember the first one? When we crashed the first time, when the investors came out and said, well, I'm really sorry, but, we didn't see it coming. Well, they don't see this one coming either. Peter Schiff said, we're broke. We owe trillions. Look at our budget deficit. Look at the debt to GDP ratio, the unfunded liabilities. If we were in the Eurozone, kick us out. My goodness. Now, let's listen to what the IMF says, the leaders of the IMF. Now, remember, the IMF are the same ones that orchestrated the Cyprus theft of people's bank accounts. IMF is the International Monetary Fund, located in Washington, D.C., controlled by America. Listen to what they say.
Let's suppose that political leaders remain dilatory or resistant. What happens?
If they cannot address this in a credible way, I believe within perhaps 2 to 3 weeks we will have a meltdown in sovereign debt, which will produce a meltdown across the European banking system. We're not just talking about a relatively small Belgian bank. We're talking about the largest banks in the world, the largest banks in Germany, the largest banks in France. That will spread. It will spread to the United Kingdom, in part through sovereign debt problems in Ireland. It will spread everywhere because the global financial system is so interconnected. They are each all those banks are counterparties to every significant bank in the United States and in Britain and in Japan and around the world. This would be a crisis that would be, in my view, more serious than the crisis in 2008.
Lord, is he exaggerating, Lord Minus?
I wish I could give a more cheerful complexion, but we're on the verge of a perfect storm. A number of European countries cannot raise money. Banks are therefore increasingly worried about the default. Therefore, people won't lend money to banks, and therefore banks won't lend money to business. So something has to be done, and has to be done substantially across the whole of Europe. If you do it individually, country by country, you should simply shift the focus from one country or one bank to another. That's why in October 2008 we obliged all the major UK banks to increase their capitalisation.
We're often accused, journalists, of being apocalyptic, but this is an apocalypse, isn't it? I mean, what happened to the spirit of the G20?
Well, I think on a more positive note, you can still see a way around this. I mean, you can still see a way of taking concerted action which would now the banks have got short-term funding, so they can get short-term funding from the European Central Bank, so there's not an immediate liquidity crisis. If we can get a situation where the banks are recapitalised, where the Greek situation is sorted out, and the markets can therefore be convinced that Spain and Italy, which are really the big ones, will get through this, even with some trouble, and we can push things out a couple of years until that happens, then I think it can still be averted.
Are we talking about a crisis here that affects, apart from the taxpayer having to bail out a bank if action is taken, if the banks go under, does it affect ordinary people?
Well, it will have an effect on economic activity. It's worthwhile saying here, Jeremy, that the UK banks are pretty strongly capitalised. This is not a problem for UK and Scandinavian banks.
You've already heard Dr. Shapiro say it will affect the UK banks.
It will affect the UK economy. It will affect the UK economy, which is why we have an interest in the outcome. But the UK banks, in relative terms, are very well capitalised compared with most European banks.
Dr. Shapiro, go on.
Well, what we don't know, we do know, for example, in the United States, our banks have relatively little exposure to European sovereign debt. They've been getting rid of those holdings for a year. However, no one knows the state of credit default swaps held by these institutions against sovereign debt and against European banks. Nor do we know the state of credit default swaps held by British banks. Nor are we certain of how serious the exposure of British banks is to Ireland's sovereign debt problem.
Right. What needs to happen right now, Lord Miners?
Very significant agreement across Europe to recapitalise the banks. This problem can be solved, Jeremy. It's within the wit of man to do it, but it requires the political will of Europe's leaders to agree a programme as soon as possible.
And thus far, we haven't seen it, have we?
No, I mean, they're talking in more urgent terms about the plan for the plan, but we haven't got the plan yet, and we need to get that now.
Thank you all very much indeed.
We really need two things. We need not only to recapitalize the banks, even more crucially, we have to come up with a credible plan to preserve the stability of the sovereign debt of Italy and Spain.
Okay, thank you all very much indeed.
You know, my favorite statement was there is what you just said. We need a plan for the plan, but we haven't got a plan yet. Now, is that the kind of double speak that you get from like a used car salesman? We need a plan for the plan, but we don't have it yet. My goodness, what's our economy based on here in America? What's our biggest jobs provider? You know, if we leave this to the government government's going to say, well, we're going to rebuild infrastructure and we're going to prop up all the corporations who provide all of the jobs and blah, blah, blah. No, it's not. America is founded on small business. Small business is the largest employment provider in this country. And they're murdering small business. The Obama administration is murdering small business because the percentage of self-employed Americans is at a record low. The percentage of Americans that are working for themselves has never been lower in the history of the United States. You know, once upon a time, the United States was a paradise for entrepreneurs and small business. Now the control freaks, the bureaucrats that dominate our society have created the system that absolutely eviscerates them. They're murdering small business. The bureaucrats are destroying the primary engine of job growth in this country. One of the biggest reasons why there are not enough jobs in America today is because small business creation is down. Entrepreneurs, small business, are being devastated by rules and regulations, red tape, oppressive levels of taxation. Now, if anyone doubts that small business in the United States is dying, I'm going to give you some examples of this. From 1970 to the mid-1990s, the number of unincorporated, self-employed Americans rose steadily. But in the mid-1990s, it began to level off. Now, it's falling, and it's fallen fast. At this point, about 7% of non-farm workers are self-employed. This is depressingly low. This means that an overwhelming majority